the big storm on the horizon, 2025. We're going to go through a time warp. You're going to see radical disorder in the next 5 years. First, I should explain that experience I had of learning that many of the things that surprised me because they didn't happen in my lifetime before, but they happened many times in history. The first time I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange in 1971, and the United States, Nixon defaulted on the promise to deliver gold for money because they didn't have enough money, real money, gold, and it went down. I went on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange expecting a big down. It went up a lot. That's because I never had a devaluation. If it happened that, I found that in March 1933, the exact same thing happened with Roosevelt on the radio, same thing. Then I studied the 30s, what happened in 1938 in terms of the depression leading to the wars and so on, and the interest rates hitting zero is the exact same thing that happened in 2008. It was because I studied that we were able to make a lot of money in the 2008 financial crisis. So 3 things started to happen in my lifetime, our lifetimes, that never happened before. And I needed, therefore, to study them in history. The first is the amount of debt and money creation. Huge amounts of debt and money creation. Does that matter? What is the rise and decline of a reserve currency? How does that all work? I needed to see the cycles for that. The second was the amount of internal political conflict, in particular populism of the left and populism of the right. And a populist is a person who will not accept losing. They fight with their contingency, and that dysfunction and that lack of willingness to lose then had January 6th came out after the book, and there's a dynamic that we're going on for that. And the third, of course, is the great power conflict. In other words, the rise of a comparable economic and military power in the form of China rising and competing with the United States, which is also changing that world order. Those 3 things never happened in my lifetime, but are big things that are affecting things. When I went back in history, I said I needed to study how these things work. Sometimes we overlook the really big things. So I went back and I studied that, and I saw that there were 2 others that had enormous impact. The 2 others were acts of nature, in particular drought, floods, and pandemics. And they killed more people, and they toppled more empires and changed more world orders than anything. And certainly, big issue. Now, number 5 is technological changes and how they evolve. So I needed to study those 5 forces. I saw that there's this cycle that repeats over for good cause-effect relationships. I don't believe in a cycle just because it repeats. I started to understand the cause-effect relationships.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires of the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. In this study, I used 8 metrics: education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. Better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. the empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more money. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.